So welcome, my name is Mary Jane McKitterick and I am the Community Planning Manager with Away Home Canada. This is the fourth in a series of webinars this year from Away Home Canada designed to increase knowledge and capacity on youth homelessness community planning. Our focus today is all about getting to a place where we can support and measure an end to youth homelessness through research and data. I would like to take this time to thank the Government of Ontario for their generous support of this webinar series and their commitment to increasing capacity of communities to prevent and end youth homelessness. I would also like to acknowledge that this series is in partnership with OMSSA, the Ontario Municipal Social Service Association, and COH, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. A special thank you to Oksana from the COH today for all her support in the setting up and running of these webinars. Away Home Canada is a national coalition dedicated to preventing and ending youth homelessness. Details about our coalition partners and recordings can be found at awayhome.ca. Our presenters today are Dr. Alina Turner. Among her many qualifications, Dr. Turner is a leading homelessness researcher and is a fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. She supports a variety of organizations to support human service system planning and integration, including plans to end homelessness and transitions to housing first. Dr. Turner provides valuable content expertise to Away Home. Jesse Donaldson is a Senior Strategist and National Point-in-Time Count Coordinator for the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, has several years of international experience in research, policy, and communications across issues including homelessness, policing, youth, and corporate social responsibility. She supported communities to prepare for the 2016 Point-in-Time Count led by the Homelessness Partnering Strategy and has developed an integrated youth methodology to be implemented in 2018. Prior to this, she co-authored the State of Homelessness in Canada 2013 and co-developed the Home Depot Canada Foundation strategy to end youth homelessness. Many of you probably know me from previous webinars. I am the Community Planning Manager with Away Home Canada, and I've been working directly with communities and continue to develop youth homelessness community plans since we began this work in 2012. My role this year is focusing on developing a community of practice for community planning in Ontario and then scaling that across Canada. So our agenda today is as follows. I'll begin just by providing a little bit of information about our webinar series. And then Dr. Turner will take over with the overview of the Youth Homelessness Data Dashboard and with a focus on understanding and enumeration for youth homelessness community planning. And then we have Jesse who's our expert on PIT counts and will really focus on that for us. Followed by that, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A, so please write your questions into the chat box as we're progressing, if that helps you to remember them. We won't be answering them right away. We'll wait till the Q&A, but you can add them in now or later as you think of them. So just to review our webinar series this year, it's organized into two phases and built upon one another to form a full curriculum for community planning. Phase one, which ran from January to March, provided the fundamentals and using our community planning toolkit, which you can access with under the helpful links to the right of your screen. Folks at different stages of this process within their own communities or across communities can quickly reach the same level of familiarity with concepts, tools, and resources through these webinars. All the webinars are recorded and hosted on our website. The link is at the top of this slide, but you can visit awayhome.ca and navigate to the community planning section as well. You can search YouTube too. Phase two is a deeper dive into specific topics. So our topic for today, which is the research and data management, or sorry, the enumeration, but we're also going to be digging into topics around funders, systems integration, government policy, youth collaboration, achieving early wins, etc. throughout the year. So today's webinar is the first in a two-part series of phase two, so we're beginning into phase two now, but it's also in two parts dedicated to research and data in youth homelessness community planning. This is a big topic, and communities have expressed a need to know more about how to use research and data to understand youth homelessness and develop evidence-based solutions to prevent and end it, as well as measuring that progress. So today we will introduce the 4 pillars of our data dashboard, and I'm particularly excited about this as it is a clear way to help us understand and organize how all that the growing number of research reports, tools, and methods relate to one another and how to use them effectively. We will then focus on the first two pillars of the dashboard, which is understanding the research and then the enumeration piece. This is particularly useful for Ontario service managers who are now planning their enumeration strategies for 2018. We will present part 2 of the research webinars on July 12th, which will focus on the remaining 2 pillars of our dashboard. One is data management that talks about a range of tools available for things like access assessment, program outcomes, case management, etc. And then the final dashboard will be measuring progress as performance measurement. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Alina Turner to begin today's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, and hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And if you don't, then somebody write something. But I'm not saying anything, so I'll just keep going.
You're good, Alina.
Okay, good. Excellent. We had some technical difficulties earlier, so yeah, that's the most awkward thing when you're like half an hour into your presentation and somebody's like, there's nobody there. Okay, so just a little bit of background on this data dashboard that you're seeing on the slides in front of you. And I wanted to first say that calling it a data dashboard might be a little misleading. It's really a conceptual framework. So there isn't necessarily this, you know, data dashboard with all these charts and various levers in terms of measurement at this point. We're working towards that, but we wanted to present something to you that kind of got your thinking in this direction going, and an opportunity for us to also get your feedback as this data dashboard is being developed by Away Home and the COH. So having said that, that doesn't mean that there isn't work for us to do in terms of creating this data dashboard and talking about it with you today. So in terms of the key components of this data dashboard, we've divided it into 4 conceptual categories. Again, the other piece to think about here is that it's a framework and all these pieces are interrelated. So it's not like we're going to talk about understanding of the causes of youth homelessness and then there's a separate category in terms of enumeration and data management, et cetera, et cetera. We're dividing it into these chunks so that they're digestible for folks that may not be as familiar with research in their day-to-day practice. But all that being said, they are very much interrelated. And when you get to the end of these webinars, we're hoping that you'll see that as well. So the 4 pillars, just to give you an overview right now, the first is understanding. So talking about the causes and conditions of youth homelessness, and again, I'll go through that in a bit more detail. Enumeration, assessing the current situation, particularly at the community level. Data management, this is where we get into some of the more robust information management systems that are out in various communities, so homeless management information systems, program outcome assessment approaches, case management, and shared measurement processes in community. So again, that will be the focus of our next webinar. So I'm introducing some of these concepts, talking to you about how they relate to understanding and enumeration. But having said that, data management and the next one, which is demonstrating progress, so work on performance management, indicators of progress on ending youth homelessness, et cetera, are going to be the focus of our next webinar, which is going to be happening in July. I believe it's July 11 as well. So next slide. A couple of pieces that are foundational to the development of the dashboard or the framework for measurement towards an end to youth homelessness. Here's a couple of the values that are underpinning it. So the first one is addressing youth homelessness from a human rights perspective. So having that lens as we do our research and data collection. Oftentimes we think about the human rights work as a policy issue or a practice piece, but what we're saying to you is it's a lens that's valuable when you develop your research methodology as well, and all your data collection practices shouldn't obviously be misaligned with this value of youth homelessness from a human rights perspective. The second one is tools and resources that are consistent with positive youth development orientation. So again, if our tools are perhaps recreating repressive conditions and creating more barriers for youth that to their development, then obviously that's not going to be aligned with our values. So we can have, on the one hand, a system that values positive youth development, but then a research and performance management process that does exactly the opposite. So again, things that should be evident, but you'd be surprised how often, because we compartmentalize data collection from our practice work or from our policy advocacy, sometimes we don't make the connection in practice, unfortunately. So it bears thinking through this today as well. Third one is young people are engaged in the development of tools and resources. So again, this value of the youth voice, that it shouldn't be something that is only happening when you're consulting to develop your youth plan, but it should be something that you do on a go-forward basis as you develop your point-in-time counts, your by-name list, your information management systems, etc. And that obviously will help you ensure that your approach is going to be aligned with the human rights and a positive youth development orientation as well. So it reinforces those other values too. And number 4, the service providers and policymakers have important knowledge. So obviously, and this is maybe more of a reminder to the researchers and the academics that are sometimes in the leadership role in the development of research approaches and performance and evaluation methods, etc. But that is to say, we can't prioritize one type of knowledge over the practical understanding of youth homelessness dynamics that we see obviously in the lived experience voice, but also in your expertise as service providers dealing with this issue on the ground. And of course, the policymakers and decision makers and funding bodies, for instance, that also have a very valuable perspective to share in this work. And the last one, and a very important point, is the embedding of a cultural competency approach. So having a lens to ensure that Indigenous, LGBTQ2S, and ethnocultural perspectives are respected in your performance management and in your data collection processes as well. So an example would be if you know Indigenous youth are overrepresented in your system, but after you do your data collection process, you see that your data is not reflecting that, then obviously there's something amiss, and you need to go back to the drawing board to figure out what that is. So all that this value speaks to is the need to pay attention to these particular subgroups, because they are overrepresented, and they do merit particular attention to ensure we're incorporating their perspectives as we build out our approach to measurement, and that we have that lens to the analysis of the data as well, that we report on Indigenous youth homelessness or LGBTQ2S issues, ethnocultural and newcomer youth issues as well. Okay, so those are the values. The next piece is around data management. So this idea of supporting communities to prevent and end homelessness and how that relates into key data management processes that you might have in place or you might be considering to put in place. Intake and assessment tools, case management tools, outcomes measurement frameworks. Again, I'm just giving you a bit of a taste of what's to come in part 2 of the webinar, which is going to be in July. But this is where we're going to talk about things like let's say the vulnerability assessment tool for youth, or case management tools like the outcomes measurement framework, system planning frameworks that have a youth focus. Obviously those pieces need to be aligned with the values that you have, and then have to fit into your broader approach to data collection management and how you're going to be measuring progress as a system and as a program or agency around youth homelessness. Okay, so that's the data management piece. And then demonstrating progress. This is, again, gets us into a lot of the system planning work and system planning language, especially when we talk about creating indicators at the community level that help us get a sense of whether we're successful as a system in preventing and ending youth homelessness. So what do those indicators look like? Who collects them? How do we interpret them? If they don't exist, how do you even begin to set up a process to collect them? The community and regional analysis component is critical as well, and again, leveraging some of your local data to speak to regional issues, especially when migration is involved, for instance, and then national, provincial, and territorial tracking. So recognizing that youth homelessness is not something that's unique to your local community, but being able to connect the dots and connect those dots for your jurisdiction as well as broader national and provincial territorial trends. So that's, again, the July part. I hope that that's interesting to you and that you have a sense of what we're going to be talking about then, so that in today's conversation, you'll have this in the back of your mind as well. And again, to remind us that all these pieces are very much interrelated. So there's going to be a lot of overlap between these four buckets of the data dashboard. Okay, so we'll get into the understanding homelessness and the second piece around enumeration today in a little bit more detail. And in terms of the topic for today and the piece that we wanted to focus on is really around how you're going to be using the evidence base to build your local strategies and how you're going to be understanding your local context to A, develop a plan to end youth homelessness, and B, implementing that plan. We wanted to also bring attention to the research that has already been developed for you, and there's no need to go into the huge body of literature on youth homelessness and try to figure out what the causes and conditions might be, because a lot of that work has already been analyzed for us by Away Home and COH. So you'll see there that there's a mention of Away Home in the COH policy briefs and the youth homelessness research that's available through the Homeless Hub that speaks to a lot of the pieces that you'll need at your community level. Now, the challenge with those pieces is that they're not necessarily localized, right? So Away Home and COH's perspective is generalized at the national level. They're not necessarily going to give you the best overview of what's happening at the local community or at your various jurisdictional levels that you might be working at. However, this gives an excellent overview of the systemic causes of and conditions of youth homelessness, so the specific subpopulations that we're talking about, so youth that might be experiencing homelessness that are Indigenous and how that differs from mainstream populations, what the best practices are for addressing youth homelessness among these groups, etc. Okay, and here's a couple more resources for you. So Without a Home, the National Youth Homelessness Survey, this was a major piece of work that was done by, led by Dr. Gates, as you'll see there, and it was done across communities in Canada and helps you get a sense of what the issue looks like across the country. Like I said, if you're one of the participating communities and you'll see a list of who these communities are, then you might have additional local data that you can mine or you can leverage in your materials and in your planning, but a lot of communities were not part of that. So having said that, there's a lot of generalized findings that you can still use as you build your local strategy as well. And you'll see there the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, which is a new initiative by Away Home. And I believe Jesse's going to give you a bit of a quick rundown of what this is all about and how it relates to understanding homelessness. So Jesse, do you want to give a little blurb on this?
Perfect. So there's also a link on the side if you guys want to find out more. But Making the Shift was a recently launched large multi-year project, and it's a partnership between Away Home Canada, the COH, MARS, and then provincial and community partners across the country. And the purpose of the project is a collaborative project to develop but also scale innovative and also proven program models to prevent and end youth homelessness. So through demonstration projects, if you think of them similar to pilots, we're going to generate a significant amount of data on youth homelessness generally, which of course contributes to our understanding of causes and conditions of youth homelessness, but it also will help us understand the outcomes we're striving towards and the interventions that are best placed to achieve those outcomes. So I think in this understanding bucket, maybe causes and conditions is almost too narrow. We need to think about it more broadly as how we're also responding to those causes and conditions. So as Alina noted, understanding homelessness, it's driven by sort of traditional research and academic studies, but we also need to think creatively about what other data sources we're using to understand homelessness at a national, regional, and also a community level.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so and the next bucket, or the second bucket, for now we're calling them buckets, so I think they're supposed to be called pillars formally. So
I like it.
So sorry about that. That's kind of what we do in these webinars, is make new names up for things. So around enumeration, this is the stuff that is probably going to be most familiar to you, because these are the things that you're seeing in your everyday practice, or popping up in terms of funder expectations and national direction from HPS. So obviously the point-in-time counts, the homeless counts, and how youth homelessness is going to be integrated in those initiatives. And Jesse will give you the rundown in a lot of detail, so stay tuned for that. And registry weeks, which are related to by name lists, shelter studies, again, particularly for communities that have implemented an HMIS, a homeless management information system, or a particular version of an HMIS, which is HISIS. Those communities will have additional information that can feed into your local plans development and tracking progress, etc. Hidden homelessness, so prevalence research, is another resource as well in this bucket. So I'll speak a little bit about these just to give you an introduction. The PID count component and how this relates, usually a point-in-time count is exactly what you'd think about. It's essentially the data collection effort of a community on homelessness that happens on a particular day or a particular night, and that would generate data for you to assess whether particular demographics are overrepresented in your community, and trends year after year if you're doing this on a longitudinal basis. These are now endorsed by HPS, and we have a national methodology for them. We also have adaptations to ensure that we're capturing some of the hidden youth homelessness aspects that might not be captured adequately in a traditional point-in-time count. And that's because PID counts tend to focus on people who are sleeping rough and people who are in emergency shelters or transitional housing facilities. So like I said, Jesse's going to give you a much more detailed overview of this piece. So what I'll do is I'll speak to registry weeks and by name lists, and I'll link these together because they're usually part of a similar package that communities that are part of the 20,000 Homes campaign or are considering being part of the 20,000 Homes campaign would sign up for. So a registry week is very much related to a point-in-time count in that volunteers will go out and do assessments, so follow a standardized set of questions that include some of the point-in-time elements, but have additional assessment questions tagged onto them. So it's a bigger, obviously, set of questions and set of data that you're going to be generating out of it. The other piece that's different between a point-in-time count and a registry week is that, well, one is a point-in-time and one is week. So it's exactly that. It's happening in sequence over a number of nights, so it's not just happening one time. And these registry weeks are intended to kickstart your community system planning efforts to generate a sense of urgency around a by name list. So literally, as you go out into the community, you'll collect people's names and their, let's say, vulnerability score, their level of needs, their preferences for housing, etc. So a whole number of items, and I'm sure if you want more information, we'll have that available to you, or you can take a look at the 20,000 Homes campaign website as well. So the by name list that's generated is a list of names, and beside it there might be a SPDAT or an assessment score indicating level of need reported during that night. And the idea is that you would take that list and then you would work off of it to intervene as a community. So you might have kind of a one-stop shop approach that's already existing in community that would take on that list and manage it as from a coordinated access perspective. And if you don't, you might bring your community providers together and say, okay, well, the first person on our list is Bob, and these are the issues he reported to us during the registry week, and what spaces do we have available in community, who is able to connect with him and get him housed and get him supported, etc. So that's kind of the big difference between registry weeks and by name lists versus a point-in-time count. Point-in-time counts are primarily anonymized, which means that you're not collecting data from people that is personal. So you're not collecting names, you're not collecting date of birth, for instance. It's much more general level. It's much more research versus intervention focused, which it's kind of the decision point some communities are faced with is like, do we need to do a point-in-time count or do we do a registry week to generate a by-name list? And I would say it really depends on where you're at in your community. If you, for example, have an HMIS, a Homelessness Management Information System, or you're in the process of developing one, then your HMIS will generate as many by-name lists as you need to. So you might not necessarily need it in that case because in some ways you already are sitting on a by name list. However, in some other instances, you might not have that. The data might not be shared among your HMIS participating agencies, or you might want to create a sense of urgency leveraging the point-in-time count. So again, in that instance, a registry week might be a good idea for you as well. The other piece to highlight is that point-in-time counts are it's not an either-or with registry weeks and by name lists. In fact, the process that 20,000 Homes developed is aligned with HPS's standards for the HPS count, the homeless count. So you can satisfy both points there, right? So it's not an either or. It just really means you need to consider where your community is at, what the appetite is for either slant, but really to me they're part of a continuum that you can vacillate through. The only thing to consider is longitudinally ensuring that whatever you choose is going to be comparable, or you have a really good rationale for why you would switch as well, because the data might not be comparable if you do a week-long survey versus if you do a point-in-time survey. So obviously that you're going to get very different data sets between those two. Okay, so the next piece to highlight there is shelter studies. These are usually undertaken either by academics or they're undertaken by funding bodies. The HIFIS development team will also generate shelter studies that highlight how many people go in and out of the shelter system, what their characteristics are in terms of indigeneity or ethnocultural background, their age. So obviously we get some good data on youth homelessness, et cetera. And then prevalence research. So prevalence research is trying to get to this hidden homelessness piece. So they really are connected there. Because we recognize that not everybody's going to touch our homeless serving system, which means that we need to find different methods, especially to get to some of the youth that might be couch surfing, et cetera. And some of the adaptations of the point-in-time count are getting us closer to that. And I said, Jesse will speak to the St. John's approach where they did exactly this. The other way that prevalence research is done is through more traditional kind of Ipsos read opinion surveys. So sometimes these might be commissioned by a national body or a consortium of interested communities or an academic research body to essentially survey the population to get a sense of how many might be experiencing hidden homelessness. And because we ask about age and various demographic factors, we can break it down by age to get a sense of the youth prevalence within that sample. Now, of course, with everybody moving online and having access to cell phones versus landlines, that has challenged those methodologies a little bit, but they're also adjusting to the new technologies and leveraging social media to do that type of work. So that is another resource that is available to help you in understanding the situation. All these pieces are of various use depending on where you're at in the plan development and implementation process. So if your community has nothing in place in terms of how many youth are experiencing homelessness, if you've done registry weeks but you look at the list and you're seeing that you're capturing 2 youth out of 20 entries, then obviously the data collection method is not adequate to get to
to what's happening in the community around youth homelessness. And that's another lens that we need to place on all these pieces. One is how they relate to your community's ending homelessness strategy, so the broad general strategy and general plan to end homelessness. But it's another game when you're getting into how these help you understand youth homelessness in particular. So like I said, PIT counts are a great resource to get a sense of how many youth might be in your visible system, so emergency shelter, transitional housing, public systems is another piece where point-in-time counts can be useful because you can do them, the surveys in correctional facilities, you can do them in emergency rooms, you can even do them with child intervention services and school boards if they're engaged in the issue as well. But to do that, you need to have a youth lens to the point-in-count methodology because, like I said, the traditional way is to really focus on the visible homelessness population. So the chronic, the episodic homeless population is where a lot of the initial methods went when they were initially developed. Now we're getting a lot more sophisticated in understanding that those methods need to be adapted to capture youth homelessness in a much more accurate way. But that means that you need to have that lens and ensure that if youth are not showing up in your point-in-time count, that doesn't mean there's no youth homeless. That means there's something going on with your data collection approach. The other piece is registry weeks and by name list. Again, it depends, just like the point-in-time count, where those registry weeks are occurring. So are you engaging the youth serving sector? Are you engaging the child intervention system, the education system in helping you develop those lists? Because again, that's another challenge. And then of course, it depends how you use your resulting by name list to develop interventions. So if the by name list prioritizes people with long-term homelessness, well, by virtue of youth being youth, they're going to have less time to have the so-called opportunity to experience long-term homelessness. So they're not going to necessarily be prioritized for an intervention if they're being grouped with adults. And of course, we know that interventions need to be tailored to youth as well, and it's not necessarily the same service providers that need to be at the table, et cetera. So what some communities have done in those instances is create separate tables that take the same data sets, but one table for adults might be parceling and focusing out on the adult interventions, and then the other group might be focusing on the children and youth or family interventions. So this would be Calgary's approach. They don't have registry weeks per se, but they have an HMIS that they use to generate lists and acuities and levels of needs, and then they have planning tables that come around the various priority populations I mentioned. So adults, youth, and families are the primary ones. And the way that those populations are assessed, of course, to match them to services is also different. So youth use a different variation of the VI-SPDAT tool versus the adults and families as well. So that's another piece. Somebody's asking me, how do you reconcile the results of different enumeration approaches to answer the question of the number of homeless youth you have in your community that you can defend when stipulating the needs of a community? Okay, totally good point, and I will get there just as soon as I, actually no, I can get to it right now because this is a good opportunity to demonstrate how all these pieces come together. So with developing your plan to end youth homelessness and even progress reports on how are we doing now that we have a plan, et cetera, I would recommend that you do as much data source triangulation as possible. So if you do have a point-in-time count, remember it's a PIT, it's point in time. So let's say you have in your PIT 100 people and 25 are under the age of 24. So your message to the community is not that we have 24 people who are homeless. Absolutely not. Your message to the community is in a point in time, 25% of those enumerated were under the age of 24. So that's one way to message it. So talking about the proportion that you're seeing out of the whole population is one. The other message is if you have a study and
2016, and it said there were 25 out of 100 that were youth. And you have another study in 2018, or another PIT in 2018, and at that time, you're saying that there's 35 out of 100 youth. So in that instance, you're seeing an increase in the proportion of the homeless population that are young people. So the point of that is it that the youth population is growing, or is it that your data collection methods have changed, or whatever? Has your system shifted its approach so that it's more, I don't want to say attractive, but more appropriate for young people, and thus you're seeing them more in those facilities? So you have to be able to explain those pieces in your messaging. But back to your point around how we reconcile this. So you've got your PIT in your back pocket, and you've got that data. The other piece that you should have in a system planning community is that you should have an information management system that is able to generate unduplicated counts of how many people, regardless of age, regardless of funders, regardless of program type, et cetera, how many people are using your homeless serving system. So the ones that you are really concerned about when you're speaking about how many youth are experiencing homelessness is those that are being reported as sleeping rough by your outreach programs, and those that are using your emergency shelter system, and those that are using your transitional housing system or programs, because those are the ones, those three pieces fit in the classification of homelessness of the national definition of homelessness. So that doesn't mean that youth that are couch surfing are not homeless. We're just trying to get a sense of the data from HMIS that helps us shed a better light on the PIT count. And what usually you see in that data is that it's not that you have 25 youth experiencing homelessness. You're closer to about, let's say, 700, 750 youth. So the multiplying factor differs by community, from community to community, because it depends how many unique youth during this particular year are going in and out of shelters, and how long they're staying in that shelter, because that's the other piece to it. Once you have that data, having a sense of how many of the youth are constantly using your emergency response system, emergency shelter, transitional housing, how many of them are coming into that system, leaving the system through your housing interventions, but as a result of whatever reason or whatever might be happening in that program, or when they exit that Housing First program or intervention program, they're then showing back up in your crisis response and emergency services. So that rate of recidivism is, again, something you can calculate out of that HMIS data. So that's why I'm really encouraging for communities to think about how all this fits into the eventual creation of an HMIS, because a point-in-time count, a registry week, a by-name list, a shelter study, all these pieces are just reports out of an HMIS. So they're kind of steps along the way that you can take to get to your eventual HMIS, but really without that HMIS, you're a little bit blind to what's happening in your system. So when you see that data and you compare it to the point-in-time count, like I said, you'll see that it's not 25 youth that are experiencing homelessness. It's more like 750 youth are using your emergency shelters and transitional facilities during the course of a year. So is that the number you report to community? Well, it's one of the numbers you report, but you always put a caveat to say, we know this number does not necessarily capture all the people that are, all the youth that are experiencing hidden homelessness, couch surfing, staying with friends and family, or in unsafe housing situations. The challenge with that is we don't know what that hidden homeless number is unless you do a prevalence study. And that's something your HMIS will not ever get you. So I would say in the ideal world, if we're fast forwarding 10 years from now, to truly understand what's happening in your system around youth homelessness, you want to have a robust HMIS that all your programs are participating in and sharing data in, so that it can help you coordinate your response and help you get the data to get a sense of what the issues are and how your system is responding to youth homelessness, and then combining that with a prevalence study that is localized. So it's not good enough
to your decision makers and your local community to say, well, nationally we know for every one youth that's using emergency shelter, there's 5 that are experiencing hidden homelessness. We can use that for now, but the question is going to be, well, what about in Wellington? What about in Toronto? Right? What about in St. John's? It's got to be a localized or have enough robustness that we can drill down to the community level to see what those variations might be and to track those variations in hidden homelessness. So that's kind of my spiel around enumeration and how they relate to each other. And like I said, I hope that helps you. Oh, thank you. Okay. So, and if you want to see how communities have messaged this, so communities that have HMISs and shelter studies and pit counts, et cetera, I would say take a look at the Youth Plan to End Homelessness Refresh, just published a month ago from Calgary Homeless, not Calgary Homeless Foundation, it's actually the youth sector in Calgary. So they did all of these components to come up with a better understanding of youth homelessness. And you'll see there how they message exactly to your point, Scott, how they combine this data to create a narrative around youth homelessness and trying to communicate that to a wider audience. All right. So grounding your approach in evidence and how we're actually going to locate existing information so you're not duplicating research that's already out there, how you engage in research, and like I said, Jesse's going to get into this in more depth, the policy analysis, the environmental scanning, and the system mapping. All of these pieces, like I said, feed into those 2 key buckets around understanding youth homelessness, and particularly in your community, and enumeration. But they very much will help you in the future as you track progress and manage your data collection and analysis as well. So there are strategies that help you meet those broader measurement goals. So let's get into some of these in more detail. Sometimes it helps us to just frame the questions in terms of what we're trying to get at. So I try to put some of these out to you as well. So the first one, obviously, just what Scott said, how many youth are experiencing homelessness, what are their needs, what are their demographics, what are their pathways into homelessness, what would work best for whom and when, and what are the emerging trends we need to be aware of. So there you go. That's the questions that we're often trying to answer as we develop plans to end homelessness and implement those plans in practice. The other piece that we're not going to, unfortunately, have time to get into this today, but once you have a really good sense of the research and the evidence body and some of these numbers, what I find of particular value is using this in system mapping and system modeling. So and this is something that funders often ask you for, well, how much money will I save if I end homelessness? How many youth need to go through how many program spaces? And do I need housing first intensive case management, or can I do housing first permanent supportive housing for youth, or should I be doing FOIA models? And what do those scenarios look like for our community? What's going to work best for what population within your youth demand pool? So that type of technical work is absolutely possible if you have a good handle on this research piece. Like I said, unfortunately, that might be one of those webinars we do with people who really care about system mapping and system modeling, but this is kind of laying some of the groundwork for that. And answering these questions is going to be essential no matter what stage you're at in the planning process or plan implementation. Okay, so key questions continued. What solutions work well? So this speaks to best practices. Solutions proven to be less effective, so especially with some of the, I'm not sure what to call it, but some of the lashbacks, to be honest, around transitional housing and the role of emergency shelters. So being able to answer what component of your homeless serving system works well for youth, and what is the most appropriate intervention and in what time. So I'm of the stance that all these components have an important role to play if they're part of a system. So I think a great Housing First program, if it's not playing well in the system of care, can doesn't matter that it's housing first or not. If it's doing things on its own and it might be duplicating efforts, it might be creating negative feedback loops into the system, then it's ultimately not as effective as it could be. And same thing with emergency shelters. Emergency shelters have an absolute essential role to play in ending youth homelessness as gateways to service, as places where youth can connect and be safe and start their recovery journeys and connect to the appropriate resources to get housed or have family reconnection happen. So that's the one piece to keep in mind in all of this, is that it's got to be seen from a system planning lens. The next one is, how do policies and practices within agencies and government departments impact youth homelessness? So as you track data longitudinally, you're able to also monitor when decisions are made around funding or when new initiatives come on stream or when a policy change takes effect and what that does to the youth homelessness dynamics in the community as well. Without tracking this data longitudinally, you won't be able to make those inferences in terms of impact. The other piece to this is that while we're talking today about quantitative data, in many instances and best practices and academic research, having that connection to lived experience and that lived experience voice, again, coming back to our principles early on that I talked about. So the service provider lens, the policy funder lens, and then the lived experience lens, and having those conversations happen on an ongoing basis to add context to what you're seeing in the data is absolutely essential, because we as researchers, or you as in your practice roles or policymaker roles or research role, might be making assumptions that are absolutely not accurate, and I've been guilty of this many a time, so I'm truly speaking from humbled experience on this one. So having the lived experience advisory on not just how you develop your data collection methods, but how you interpret and what your key messages might be is also going to be helpful in shedding light on the trends from different perspectives. Okay, the cost of the status quo and the cost of resolving the issue. So this speaks to the need for that modeling that I talked about before of understanding what program types and what those program interventions would cost over time and what their impact over time might be, and then even running different scenarios to say, well, we could be investing significantly in supportive housing that's place-based in a congregate setting for youth, but that might not be the best answer given that construction costs are what they are and we don't have any capital coming forward, so we might need to leverage the market more significantly in the short term. So being able to do that type of system analysis and relating that to financial decisions and financial planning, again at a community level, not just at the program or agency level, because I know that's very much part of your work today, but putting that lens at a community of care level is going to be essential around moving the plan forward, especially in implementation. Okay, so a couple of tips around locating the evidence and giving you a sense of the wealth of information that is already at your fingertips, so you don't need to necessarily replicate. But some of this might be new to you, and if it is, then great, then our job is done. And if it's not, then it might give you a different lens on how to use the information in building your strategy and implementing it. So in terms of information type, the housing market information that's available in CMHC rental markets reports and housing market analyses. And like I said, CMHC does a fantastic job giving you a sense of rental vacancy rates, home ownership versus rental needs in the community, what rental costs are, etc. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this. Why it's important is because it gives you a sense of the opportunities youth might have and the housing market dynamics that will impact those opportunities in the rental market. And it will also impact the level of reliance you can have on that market. So in other words, if you're building a strategy that calls for significant ramp up of housing first with rent supplement components, which means de facto you're leveraging the private rental market, that means if you have a
a lax vacancy rate of 5%, then go for it. That's probably going to work really well for you. But if your vacancy rate is negative, 0.2 or 0, which it is in Victoria, for instance, then that's going to be a really tough, well, it's a tough sell to the community because you're telling them that you're going to deliver on this intervention when it's going to be a tough market with rental rates are probably very high in that type of environment as well. So the community might have questions about that. That doesn't mean it's not possible. Again, I come from Calgary where that was the reality for us implementing Housing First, and it just means that you're going to have to work a lot harder to deliver that. But it also tells you that you need to balance your reliance on the private rental market with relationships and with non-market providers and potentially calling for capital investment in new supportive housing or affordable housing units to create space for the population you're trying to serve. So looking at the CMHC rental market information in your community and looking at that longitudinally to see what the fluctuations might be is an important part. And the reason fluctuations are important is because today you might have a great vacancy rate that puts you in the driver's seat in the rental market. But if your economy is in a constant ebb and flow, then that's not going to be a sustainable strategy moving long term. So you might have a phase 1 focus on the rental market and then a phase 2 focus on capital development. Okay, so that's where that comes into play in terms of the plan development and implementation strategies. In terms of demographics and how you're going to get a sense of how many people are young people in your community that might be at risk of experiencing homelessness or part of your at-risk pool or hidden homelessness demand bucket, let's call it that. So this data is obviously what we do when we don't have prevalence studies for our communities, right? Because prevalence studies are extremely costly, and so we're going to need to use what we have available to us. So what I usually try to rely on is look at the Statistics Canada National Household Survey, and yes, I know there's huge limitations to the National Household Survey, but that's what we have available today. With the new census, in a few years, not today, unfortunately this kind of analysis takes years and years to get, so we just got the 2011 2 years ago, so it's probably going to take us another couple of years to get the new census data. But when that does come available, you'll know what to do to update your plan. Today, what you can do, though, is access the Statistics Canada National Household Survey for your community and go into, and what we can do is actually share the links to all of these resources, but you can mine the data so that you can see in your community how many people are experiencing extreme core housing need. So I think you guys know what core housing need refers to in terms of housing affordability, housing adequacy, and housing suitability. Those are the 3 dimensions. And in each community or census area agglomeration, you can drill down to this. So that's a really good way of localizing the data. But what usually gets reported by CMHC is core housing need in general. And you often get into, even if you report core housing need among young people, so you can say there was, X amount of young people living in core housing need. And that's a legitimate piece, and that should absolutely be part of your messaging and part of your planning approach because it can give you a sense of what the broader population in need of affordable housing is, and we know that that's related to homelessness risk. But in terms of planning your youth strategy, it's a tough sell to say we're going to house every young person living in a household where people are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. It's a tough sell in terms of the number, and it's a tough sell because we're not doing the same thing for everybody else in the community. So we need to drill down further, and we need to drill down closer to the at-risk, at extreme, or at high risk for experiencing homelessness, because not every young person whose family might be paying more than 30% of their income on housing or who themselves might be in that situation are necessarily going to be using your emergency system. So when you drill down into who's paying more than 50%, right, so not 30, but 50% of their income on housing and who is living in poverty, so in other words, under $20,000 per year on average. In northern communities, it would be closer to 30,000, but let's say 20,000 just for illustrative purposes. You'll get a much more targeted number in terms of your planning purposes. So out of the 1,000 youth, you might actually have closer to 300. So you'll know that, and you'll know that this is a good proxy for planning perhaps your prevention interventions, right? Because you can have that number, and then you can have your next bunch of numbers, which we went to in great detail around homeless counts, shelter utilization, and service use. So if you have a sense of the extreme poor housing need among youth and what that number is, so the at-risk pool to some extent, again, not accounting for everybody, but a lot of the youth that would be in need of homelessness supports and homelessness prevention, would be in that extreme core housing need category. And you need to account for the fact that obviously it's not encompassing of all the youth in the hidden homeless population. But that gives you a bit of a sense of what the magnitude of the issue is. Right? So are we talking about 20,000 youth, or are we talking about 2,000 youth? That's a big difference in terms of planning. And then you combine that with your shelter utilization rates, et cetera.
Hi, Alina. I'm just going to let you know it's 2 p.m.
Okay. Oh, geez. Okay. Thanks.
There you go.
Okay.
No problem.
Best practice reviews, I feel like I talked about that, and going into the homeless hub engine. And policy review, another key component is screening for local, provincial, federal, and government reports and websites to see where your strategy aligns with existing policies and where government is going on youth homelessness related issues. So it might be child intervention, education, justice, etc. Okay, strategic reports and initiatives in your community. So anything that's being produced by your United Way, for instance, or major collaborative initiatives, your actual plan to end homelessness in general as well, and of course the local research, so academic and grade literature, surveys, and consultation results that may be available in your community. So all this evidence gives you a pretty good sense of what's happening in terms of causes, dynamics, and solutions to addressing youth homelessness in your community. Okay, and I don't want to take too much of Jesse's time. So I will make a note about system mapping as well, and how important it is to have a sense of a bit of a resource directory and just an understanding of how youth use these systems and how they flow through the system of care. And I said here, don't forget about the adult providers, because many youth, in fact, again in Alberta, I'll say, majority of youth are actually not using youth-serving agencies. The majority of youth experiencing homelessness are actually in the adult system. So youth system planning and system mapping necessarily involves adult systems as well. And here you can zoom in a little bit, but you can see here a bit of a system map draft. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, obviously, because we don't have time, but it's another resource you can use to create the system mapping exercise in your community to understand the resources you already have and relate them to how youth moves through the system. Okay? And then I believe this is my last slide, and it's just truly a note about the role of continuous improvement in all this, and that it's not a one-time initiative that you do this research and you do the analysis and that's that. You're constantly going through this circle of continuous improvement around consultation, QA, performance management at the program and system level, and of course how that relates into system planning for the entire community and specifically to your youth homeless serving system. Okay, so I'll pass it to Jesse now and look forward to your questions. Oops, there she is.
Thanks, Alina. Oh, how do I? Oh, there we go. Perfect. So I know we don't have a lot of time, so let's do pick count light. I know there's a lot of familiar names, so a lot of you are already familiar with pick counts. But just to start, I guess I wanted to emphasize, as Alina noted, we are not pretending PIC counts are the only way to enumerate homelessness, and in some communities they may not be the best way to enumerate homelessness, especially youth homelessness. But the reason we're talking about it today in part is we have developed in partnership with some of you actually on the call and HPS, a youth count and integrated youth count methodology. So I want to put that on your radar. And then also because the coordinated count, of course, was announced last year, and community entities have just completed their applications. So for those who wanted to participate, they sent their applications to HPS, and we do expect that there'll be more communities participating. In 2016, 32 communities participate. It's expected there'll be more. So we just want to put it on your radar as communities start to plan the counts on what role the youth sector plays and how we can ensure youth are represented in that national effort. So to kick it off, really quickly, a PIC count is a strategy to enumerate homelessness over a 24-hour period. Like Alina mentioned, it's not everyone who's experiencing homelessness in your community. It's just a snapshot. But with successive counts, then you're able to it's one indicator of progress among the others we spoke about. Traditionally, in the coordinated count methodology, the populations you have to enumerate are unsheltered populations, so people staying on the street, sheltered populations, so emergency shelters, that includes violence against women shelters, and then transitional housing. They encourage people to enumerate in public systems like corrections, hospital, but it's not required because in some communities it's not possible. In 2016, we did see a number of communities surveying people who are experiencing couch surfing, at risk of homelessness, maybe staying in rooming houses. That's absolutely encouraged. The PIC count isn't designed to count or enumerate those forms of homelessness, but most of the enumeration methods we spoke about today. It's an inherently difficult thing to measure for all the reasons Alina spoke about. So PIC counts generally, though, they're used at a local level to systems planning. I think we covered that pretty well. And then successively to measure progress. And if I could get you thinking, first there's at the community level, but then at the regional, the provincial, and then the national level. And we are unique in Canada. We're the only country who does counts with a coordinated survey. So our ability to measure progress, we have the opportunity to really do something special. So very quickly, not a lot of time, we'll try and experiment. If you could just type in the chat box on a scale of 1 to 5 how well you think PIC counts enumerate youth, 1 being really badly and 5 being really well. And then I'll let people type as I continue. I'm seeing some twos. Awesome. Okay, 5, yay. Well, no, so I agree, we're all setting. Can I skip to the next one? Oh, there we go. So yeah, you're right. All of these answers are right in a sense. Historically, youth have been undercounted. In part, as Alina mentioned, our thinking has evolved, and typically it was PIC counts are really sort of focusing on that chronically homeless, unsheltered population over the years, and we're seeing this in the U.S. as well. We've gone through the same experience, and in some ways we're a bit ahead of the game. I'm sorry for the U.S. people on the call. Yes, youth were undercounted, and that's for a few reasons. 1, youth are more likely to experience hidden homelessness, couch surfing. They also make deliberate efforts to stay out of sight for police, child welfare, and then I think a third component is the youth sector, understandably, has been resistant in some instances to participating in the count. And that's not broadly, but for real concerns that the PIC count doesn't capture youth. So I think that's in part driven some of them. So in response, the youth count was born, and that was a separate initiative to enumerate youth, and that was good. I think that needed to happen because there's a lot of very smart strategies and lessons that came out of that. So one is youth leadership, the importance of partnering with youth organizations, including hidden homelessness, different enumeration strategies, so partnering with services, partnering with schools. And I think that was great, but there's also a limitation to this approach. And one is it's not especially resource efficient. But it doesn't acknowledge that youth homelessness sits within your broader system. So in some instances, communities may have to carry forward with youth counts if there's not sufficient will within a community to conduct a count. But I think given, counts are becoming more popular, but getting more on board, that our opportunity is to really integrate this data collection strategy into our broader strategy. So Youth Count 2.0, an integrated approach, is born. We are packaging it as something new and fancy, but it's not. It's learning from communities who have started to incorporate these strategies already. So St. John's in 2016 conducted a great integrated count. Kamloops conducted a youth count, which is fantastic. Kingston did so several years ago. So really what this is just taking what we've learned and fitting it into the existing methodology. We're lucky here. HPS has created a methodology that does allow for community flexibility, and they also encourage communities, if there's resources and will and expertise, to use some of these strategies to better enumerate youth. So there's support, and we just have to figure out the technical way to do it. All right, I'm hoping I can change some of these 2s and 3s with the next slide. Integrated youth count. So how do we do it? Mentioned a little bit about this, and this again comes from COH partnered with St. John's, but also carefully followed Kamloops' count, and also in the U.S., is involving youth in planning and implementation. So that's not just asking youth at the beginning to provide input on the count. That's throughout planning and implementation. So what to ask on the survey, where to find other youth, involving youth and taking leadership roles in throwing events, magnet events to encourage other youth to come and complete the survey. And so in St. John's, we have lots of resources about it now, but that was hugely successful. The second is including hidden homelessness. So I know that's a big concern for a lot of communities, even outside of youth homelessness, is that PIC counts don't enumerate hidden homelessness. You're right, they won't. They just won't. Neither will registry weeks. We don't have a good strategy yet to count hidden homelessness. However, across all of these enumeration methods, there are ways we can capture some hidden homelessness, and we can survey people who are experiencing hidden homelessness. So I totally encourage communities to include people who are experiencing hidden homelessness in their count, and to survey those people with the recognition that that number that you get is a very, very small fraction of the people who are experiencing hidden homelessness in your community, and that needs to be communicated very carefully in your report, in media, to stakeholders, saying the PIC count's not designed for this, but we did capture this helpful information. So if you are going to include hidden homelessness, magnet events, service counts, you need alternate ways to find people who are experiencing hidden homelessness, partnering with YMCAs, youth serving organizations, food banks, sort of the unusual suspects. And then here, partnering, and this applies to the count more broadly, not just youth, but it's really something that I think makes a youth count successful, and the broader count strategy can benefit. So partnering with a broad range of youth-serving organizations, partnering with Indigenous organizations in every community, fostering leadership, so Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations taking leadership roles in the count, and also LGBTQ2S services. So we know people, as you know, everyone on the call, LGBTQ2S youth are overrepresented among the homeless population. So we need to be sure that we're conducting the count in a safe and respectful way. So 2018, now that I've got you super excited about counts and hopefully convinced you that there is hope, 2018, what's our opportunity? And I think it's a big one. So HPS, as I mentioned, will be leading March, April coordinated count. To be determined how many communities are participating, but community entities have, those who want to participate have applied. And then also Ontario. So Ontario is leading a coordinated enumeration. PIC counts are certainly not the only option. Communities are encouraged to use PIC counts, register rates, period prevalence counts. If your community in a community that's doing these things, I also just encourage you to to take some of these strategies and thinking that we're talking about here, about youth representation, and take them into those other strategies as well. So it's not just related to PIC counts. Improvements from 2016, again, we're expected that more communities will participate. Youth and Indigenous representation, participation, leadership is a priority. If you read the Homelessness Partnering Strategy methodology, you'll see they've identified it as a priority. The COH has identified it as a priority. We've included a number of different strategies within our toolkit. I think this is really, really important. So all of the communities that participate in the coordinated counts, the data is aggregated and published. So national level data on homelessness, not just the number of people, but a number of demographic and experience questions. So if you see on the right here, there's HPS coordinated Canadian point-in-time counts. That's last year's data. This year, there'll be nationally mandated questions on sexual orientation and gender. So every community participating will be required to ask those questions, and I think we're going to have an unprecedented level of information and understanding about that at the national level, which for youth homelessness, as we know, is incredibly important. And we're starting a little bit early, so you have more time, more tools, and more resources to plan. Again, there's a local benefit, but I think we all, the opportunity is also a national picture if we get this right. What's my timing?
We've got about 15 minutes left for
all right,
questions.
Almost done. So your role, I hope you're asking, great, what can I do? First is I hope get on board. It's our responsibility. It's as the coordinated count goes forward, as the Ontario efforts to enumerate go forward, as local efforts to enumerate go forward, we need to ensure that youth are represented and that the experiences of youth and the extent of youth homelessness is accurately reflected in our data. And that's going to have to be a collective effort. So if you're a youth organization on this call, I think first step is go to your CE if you don't know already, and lots of CEs work very collaboratively, so you may already know. Contact your CE, contact your service manager and say, are we conducting a count? Did we apply? And how can we help? What's the plan? Youth homelessness and the count is a priority for us. If you are client-facing and you have youth in your organization, start to talk about the count, and you're conducting one. Talk about the count. Ask them about what their priorities are, whether they'd want to be involved. If you have a youth leadership committee or council, start asking now what role they might want to play. If you're a CE or a service manager, or you're on the advisory board of a PIC count or involved, I would start contacting your youth serving organization soon and saying, what information do you need to know? How can this count support your efforts? How can we empower youth to participate in the count? How can we ensure that we're accurately representing all forms of all homelessness, including youth homelessness? So this is easy. Start the conversation. 2018 seems pretty far away, but planning will start very, very soon. How can I help? So part of my role is to support communities to plan and implement counts in 2018. So please call me, email me. It's my favorite topic. I'd love to talk about PIC counts with you. Yeah, and then also the 2018 point-in-time count toolkit. So actually Alina created the 2016 methodology and model, and we've just updated that for 2018. So you can download that. And then we have a number of PIC count resources created collaboratively with Choices for Youth in St. John's and their Youth Leadership Council. So we have a readiness assessment. It'll help you understand whether you're ready or which parts of the youth count you might want to implement. Youth count leadership, so that's getting youth actually planning aspects of the count. And then magnet events, how to run a youth magnet event, which we've seen is fairly successful in getting some feedback from youth who are experiencing hidden homelessness. How many of you think, on a scale of 1 to 5, now that youth counts might be able to, we might be able to better enumerate youth homelessness through counts? I'm nervous now. 4? Okay.
Got a 4, yeah.
I'll take that.
4.75, thanks, Dave.
There we go.
Ooh, Natalie, 7.
A hopeful 4, I think that's fair. And again, I'm happy to help, but if you have input and thoughts and things that we haven't considered, please contact me and we can generate this learning together. All right. I think I missed a question up here.
Yeah, I think Dave got it, actually. Dave's kind of our wingman. So folks, we have about like 13 more minutes, and we could probably go a little bit over, but most folks want to leave, I think, by 2:30. So could you please feel free to start typing in your questions in the chat box, and we're all in here on hand to answer those questions. Thank you to our supporters. Yes, here we are, the right slide, the question slide. So lots of data, lots of information, lots of content, and that's just the beginning. So we have a lot more to discuss around data research. Oh, it's a big topic. So yes, folks, please, all the multiple attendees that are typing, thank you. So Jamie Petrins asks us, I wonder if you could explain a bit about the difference between a period prevalence count and a registry week. Does anyone want to take that one?
Do you want to take it, Jesse? I feel like
sure.
I talked so long.
Sure. So a registry week is a sort of, if you think a data collection blitz, which will inform. Well, now I'll start with period prevalence count. So period prevalence count, I believe the methodology is over a 1-week period, and it's the idea that in rural communities it's harder to capture a snapshot in one day, so you collect data over a longer period of time. I think it's actually a really good idea, but I've also recommended that communities who are conducting period prevalence counts keep track of how many people are experiencing homelessness on a single day as well, and then that number can be used to compare sort of to other communities. A registry week, Alina, how would you compare the two?
Well, okay, so the prevalence stuff is usually done by kind of more traditional data collection methods where you have it's like opinion surveys. If that's probably the closest one you'd be familiar to in your day-to-day life. So you get a phone call from a researcher, or you're signed up in part of like a general survey pool in a community. So an omnibus survey, for instance, is another one that's used to do this. So Edmonton just finished something like this, where they have a kind of a standing mail list of participants that are always being asked about various demographic pieces or perspectives, et cetera, and it's representative of the city's population. So the sample size is adequate enough to be able to drill down into age and various demographics. So that means the prevalence population is really quite large. Versus a registry week, you're going specifically into that population as opposed to a general population survey. So,
sorry, Alina. Jamie, are you talking specifically about Ontario's third enumeration strategy?
Yes.
Okay. So Alina is correct. That is a prevalence study specifically pertaining to Ontario. I believe in the context, and that's one of the suggested strategies they've used. Yeah, it's sort of it's kind of a week-long registry week pick count. Registry weeks, of course, use a different data collection tool because there's the prioritization element of it. I haven't seen, I'm not entirely familiar with the ins and outs of the period prevalence count that it's been suggested in Ontario, but I don't believe there's a coordinated intake or assessment and prioritization element to it, but I could be absolutely wrong, and if someone on the chat knows more than me, please feel free to jump in.
Great, thank you. Kyler Rasmussen asks, how much research has interviewed or examined the parents of homeless youth to get their perspective?
That's a good one. Usually what we like to do is just focus on the youth and kind of ignore that they're part of families. So, it's a major criticism of the approach to date. So it's we're not the best at that. What I would say is the closest body of literature that would speak to that issue is actually the work being done on family homelessness, because that's where that's the focus. But it's, you know, you're kind of getting to the crux of some of our challenges, and I kind of alluded to it when I said majority of youth that experience homelessness are not even using the youth serving agencies. They're using the adult systems, and they're doing so as children of homeless parents or as parents themselves in the family system, or as families split up in various facilities, because our systems are so bifurcated because of age. So the research is similarly biased in its approach. So I don't think we've done a really good job in that area, but I would say the closest, if you're looking for those perspectives, would be in the family homelessness literature.
This is also forward-looking, but the Making the Shift project I mentioned at the beginning of this, one of the elements of that, one of the models that they'll be sort of taking to scale and testing and doing research on is family reconnect and where appropriate. So maybe there's an emerging sort of body of research and data coming out of that, we hope.
Great. Pascal asks us, is the youth pit count inclusive of youth with children? So this is a bit of more on that topic, I guess.
Go for it, Jesse.
So of youth with, so youth who are parents under the age of 24, is that the?
I think that's what they're asking, yes.
Certainly, yep. So anyone under the age of 24, that's our recommendation. You may have a different definition of youth homelessness, would be included as part of the count. Yep. And there are questions about families and children.
Great. City of Hamilton asks, have people found a gift in kind, i.e. a Tim's gift card or other, to be helpful or detrimental as a tool in getting people to participate in pit counts?
So we like to talk about it. Actually, we can put up a link on. Oksana, we put up the discussion paper on honoraria in pit counts, if you don't mind. So we like to be careful how we talk about it, of course, because we want to avoid incentivizing people to participate. It's really about adequately sort of compensating people for the knowledge and the time they've given. So absolutely, I think definitely there should be a Tim's gift card. We also in the discussion paper suggest cash as well, but I think that's often seen as a benefit. I haven't heard of any areas that have been detrimental, but if there are, I'd be open to learning about them.
Okay, so David French asks, this is so very timely. Excellent leadership on this. Alberta's plan to prevent and reduce youth homelessness, at this link, has specific actions within it that speak to developing a consistent methodology for point-in-time counts to capture youth-specific numbers. So it's a statement for us. Thank you.
Fantastic.
This is very important resource for all of us to really dive into and learn from. I know we have at Away Home really learned a lot from what the folks did at Alberta at the provincial level, so that's been really great. Did you want to comment on that at all, either of you? Or?
Totally. I totally agree with Dave.
Great. Okay, we'll just do the bells and whistles now. Okay, great.
Yeah. Confetti.
Okay, confetti. Fireworks. Natalie asks, would a pit count in non-rural areas, more urban areas, yield more results if it also was more than a 24-hour count?
Alina, can I take this one? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
So I think this is a super interesting question. It comes up a lot, and I understand why. So yes, the short answer is if you count over one day, or if you count over 5 days, you will enumerate more people experiencing homelessness than one day. If you count over 2 months, you will enumerate more people experiencing homelessness than you do a week. The trick then is to think about the purpose of the point-in-time count. It is not to enumerate everyone in your community experiencing homelessness, because we know that shifts day to day. It's just to provide a comparable snapshot. The reason we do a 24-hour period is because that's A, manageable from a data collection standpoint, but B, we can do it consistently across the country, and there's less methodological less things in your methodology over the course of a day that could affect your enumeration, say, over a course of a month or 2 months. It's also very difficult to deduplicate data. So yes, you would get more people, but the purpose of the count really is to provide that comparable 24-hour snapshot. That said, in the toolkit we recommend if youth homelessness is a priority, you can extend the count, and what that does is gives you more surveys, it gives you more data on the experience of youth who are homeless, but you have to really protect that 24-hour period, and you need to keep track of when those surveys are happening, and always ask about the same day. So if you're conducting a count on Monday, if you're still collecting surveys on Thursday, you ask where people were sleeping on Monday. So again, you're protecting that comparable 24-hour number. So does that make sense?
Mm.
Alina, I don't know
That's
if you have
great,
any
actually.
further thoughts. Yeah.
No, that's good.
Valdance, more on the incentives, says incentives can be helpful, but we also had youth that admitted to doing multiple surveys because of the incentives. So just to follow up to that. So like, yeah, so it's interesting. Kelly, my understanding is the Ontario PPC is linked with areas such as Toronto and Northern Ontario that are expansive in size. Could you, what is PPC? Just,
Period prevalence count.
oh, okay, sorry, here we go. Okay. So that's a statement, I guess, or is it a question?
I think it's my understanding that there will be guidance coming out on the period prevalence count. I haven't checked recently. It was designed, I believe, for more rural communities. And again, what's great about all three enumeration methods is you can do a combined PIT and register week. You can do a combined PIT and period prevalence count. The benefit of combining PIT to any of those is you're feeding into that national level data set, which does benefit all of us.
Okay, and Connie says, hi, I'm familiar with this count. I'm on the youth engagement side of the sector. Knowing that my peers are generally sick of surveys, I'm wondering if there's space to provide honorarium or another form of respectful recognition of their information and expertise. Likewise, for hidden homelessness on the methodology topic, would there be lots of freedom to extend to the very unusual suspects? Cheap hotels, massage parlors, strip clubs, etc. Interesting.
Okay, so I totally agree, and I'm an anthropologist, so I love going into, cheap bars and hotels to get into. I mean, that's kind of our whole thing. But this is where we get into problems with government funding and government contracts, because it obviously presents a risk to your volunteer surveyors that are, may not even be familiar with the day-to-day stuff that we see in our world. So I'm actually finding that PIT counts and anything that leverages volunteers significantly in data collection is very much influenced by the risk tolerance of the community. So but what you could do is you could complement your kind of traditional volunteer approach with an anthropological approach, or an ethnographic approach would be kind of the technical methodology used. And actually, I've done that myself in communities where we had, the HMIS, the PIT, whatever, and we also would hire an ethnographer to go out and go on the routes with panhandlers and, or go and hang out to understand the streets, families, et cetera, and how Housing First was playing out from truly the lived experience perspective. And not lived experience like consultation focus group, but lived experience in terms of hanging out day in and day out and understanding the cultural aspects. So I think that, again, we haven't even gone into this level of research from an OA home perspective or a national perspective, but it's absolutely essential to really, really understand what's going on. And in that context, the peer expertise or the lived experience expertise, they do become the relationship between the ethnographer and whoever is their kind of sponsor in the street community or or whatever community they're aiming to study becomes quite essential, and it's almost a collaborative process in how they analyze those dynamics together. So that is probably a much more, I don't know, it's a much truer and embedded way of doing the work, but it takes a lot of time. It takes relationship building, and it's usually the sample size is quite small because it relies on relationships, and yeah, that's the limitation. But really good point. So in that case, yes, motels, but I really don't see the federal government supporting volunteers going. Unfortunately, it's legit, but you know what you could do, and I've done this before, is I've recruited and trained people with lived experience from the community that I was working with, and they would do the surveys in the bars, right? I'm like, hey, this is where you hang out. It's a natural environment, blah, 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 and then they would become part of the research team. They would get training on ethics and et cetera, et cetera. They would hand out the honorarium, and they would do that over a period of time. I think in this case it was a couple months. So that's actually another way to get to the hidden homeless population as well.
That's so interesting, yeah.
I know we're low on time. I can do a really quick answer to the couple of things I'm seeing about honorarium.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So definitely look at the paper. The link is up now, the use of honorarium point-in-time counts. It covers some of it. It doesn't fix the problem, absolutely. There's a risk of duplication. Some part of that I saw in 2016 were very large honorarium that were sort of disproportionate to the amount of information and effort and time required to finish a pick count survey. And so that, I don't know how much yours was. So that's something, is scaling the size of the honoraria appropriately. And then other things is giving honoraria out in advance. So doing more of an engagement thing. But again, you have to have fairly small engagement gifts to cover the whole count. As for the sort of patronizing aspect of Tim's cards, yeah, so research, as we know in the discussion paper, people are sort of split on this. We've recommended as COH that the cash is appropriate, but you as a community need to decide how that fits. And there is some information in the paper, but if you ever wanted to discuss it, absolutely give me a call. There are larger areas using geographic-based sampling. Toronto does, for example, but based on sort of the nature of homelessness in Canada and the size, it doesn't make sense for most communities. However, though, we don't always do a full coverage approach. So some communities will just target their hotspots, the high-density areas where they expect people experiencing homelessness to be. Other communities will do a full coverage approach. I haven't seen a lot of sampling other than Toronto, but Alina, does anyone in Alberta sample?
Not that I know of. Maybe David knows.
I feel like no, but I could easily be proven wrong.
Yes.
It wouldn't be the first time.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's really interesting. We've got another question about links being shared. I don't know, Oksana, are the links shared sent to all the participants? It's incorporated in the recording, isn't it?
Yes, it'll be part of the recording, but we can also
good.
include it in the follow-up email.
Okay, great. That's good. I can do that. And there's a few typers, but I feel like we're near the, I've got some more here. I missed all these. Thanks for the link. Okay, everybody sort of, I think you've answered all of them. I think you're ahead of me.
Awesome.
Oh, there's one more. Are there any other larger areas using geographic-based sampling or any other sampling approach to help create estimated count figures instead of trying to canvass the entire area and or survey everyone?
That's a loaded question, actually. Because what we know from international studies and how other jurisdictions approach this is that they actually integrate it into their census work. So your regular census would capture homelessness as part of its standard data collection. So you would have Can you imagine having that in our census? Like it would be like, okay, just the same way that I was telling you, like HMIS is our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of this conversation needs to be getting homelessness, hidden homelessness, like all forms of homelessness into our national census. Especially when 1 out of 10 people will experience it. It's kind of an important national level statistic to capture, is my thinking. So to that point, in Europe, that is being done at various levels, in national levels, and I believe there's talk about the EU creating some standardization around how these censuses capture information relevant to homelessness and housing instability. So, we've got core housing needs through CMHC using Statistics Canada data. Why wouldn't we go a little deeper into it as well? And that would really resolve this for all of us, wouldn't it? And that would put the accountability on our mainstream research and data experts that are well funded to do this work. And absolutely, we have a role to play, and we can inform the enumeration process at the community level through our expertise in these PIT counts. But ultimately, until that happens and it becomes part of that enumeration longitudinally, then it's really going to still remain, haphazard in some ways. So that's my take.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we're pretty much near the end here. Oksana's obviously typing in. If there are any follow-up questions, we also encourage you to post them on the community workspace at Homelessness. A discussion board specific to community planning is located here. And yes, I should have brought that up at the beginning. That is a major tool that we're using to really take this conversation past just sort of moments and events and on an ongoing basis. So please sign up for well, you don't even have to sign up anymore. You could just join it and add your questions there, and we'll be sure to get back to you where everyone can see them. So I think we're about ready to sort of roll up. And Matt has offered another resource for us as well. Thank you, Matt. Houston CT. Okay, that's Connecticut, I guess. Okay, wonderful. So I just want to thank everyone. Our presenters, thank you so much. Here's our contact information. Jesse's really emphasized that you can call her up, so there she is right there, and contact her about the enumeration processes that you're involved in, especially PIT counts. We want to thank all of you for coming on this lovely day. At least it's pretty lovely in Hamilton and on Toronto. It's pretty nice to join us and to learn about this information. We are really excited about the second webinar in this series as well, which will be on July 12th, and it'll be at 2 p.m. If you haven't yet signed up, you can go to our website under Community Planning, and the link to register for the event is there. But we also share this on Twitter, Facebook, etc. as well, so you'll see that there. So thanks so much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you to our presenters and Oksana and all of our supporters. So long.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye. Bye. Bye.